Hello everybody and welcome to another Awesome Keyblade review and Five Nights at Freddy's, a series of indie horror games that during the past year has been sweeping the nation, or sweeping the internet. Mostly sweeping DeviantArt. Every game in the series has been made by only one person, that person being Scott Cawthon, who basically made the series out of spite of the criticisms he got on one of his earlier games, Chipper & Sons Lumber Company, which many critics said looked a bit terrifying. So Cawthon took this as a challenge and made his next game a horror game. A horror game about you trying to survive that was definitely not a Chuck E. Cheese, we swear. And Steam users, Let's Players, and just about everybody else on the internet has fallen in love with this series. But there are already so many horror games on Steam. Why would so many artists, musicians, YouTubers choose this game of all games? I mean, come on, Markiplier, you could have been playing The Letter! This is gameplay. Well, let's find out with the Awesome Keyblades review of the entire Five Nights at Freddy's series. And yes, I'll be looking at all 4 games of the series, from its humble beginnings to its, final chapter. Lies. So the story of the first game is that you're the night security guard at a rip-off Chuck E. Cheese known as Freddy Fazbear. And for all of my viewers that don't know what Chuck E. Cheese is, it's basically an arcade except with pizza. And it would have enough germs in it that the next day would be like opening a pack of trading cards. I mean, you don't know what you'll get. You could get a cold or a stomach flu. But the main thing that many people remember about it were the weird animatronics there. And the thing about Freddy Fazbear is that the animatronics there move around during the day, but they also need to move around during the night because if they turn off, they could also lock up. But for some reason during the night, the animatronics mistake you for an endoskeleton without its suit. So while you work there during the night, they try to forcefully stuff you into a suit, which would definitely kill you. The paycheck at the end of this better be worth it.
Wow, $120? Why, with that much money, I could buy a Foxy costume at Party City!
But one of the more engaging things about the story is what it doesn't directly tell you. As you play, you can sometimes see rare screens like children crying and newspaper clippings uncovering more about the story. Like how the animatronics are not just normal animatronics, but are also possessed by 5 children that were brutally murdered there. It doesn't have a really complicated story, but honestly I don't think it needs to. Five Nights at Freddy's is really a simple game. The only thing that you're able to do is look left and right, turn on lights, close a door, and check a camera. Your only objective during the game is to keep the 5 animatronics out of your office. The only animatronics being Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie the Bunny, Chica the Chicken, Foxy the Pirate, who I guess is coincidentally a fox, and it's also one of the only animatronics you can see moving on camera. And by moving, I mean dear god this guy's booking it like he doesn't have a New York minute to spare. Gotta go fast! And the more rare Golden Freddy. Now, why would any of this actually be difficult if all you have to do is close a few doors and check a few cameras for 10 minutes? Well, it's made a lot more complicated when you factor in your depleting energy meter. Yeah, because Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is able to afford animatronics that not even Japan's able to make, yet for some reason has awful electrical wiring. One of the best parts about the game is that it has a lot of atmosphere to it, and the color palette is really nailed because it has a lot of bright colors that are saturatedly dark. Everything surrounding it just makes you want to keep them out of your office even more, but if you fail, you get a jump scare. Now, a jump scare can work, but it's the fart joke of the horror genre. So many other games and media in general have used this as a cheap way of horror without any kind of build-up or worthwhile payoff. It doesn't actually scare you, it just startles you. I mean, I could literally just flash a Jigglypuff on the screen and have an accompanying orchestral sting, but that doesn't mean the Jigglypuff is scary. I mean, seriously, most of these jump scares aren't scary in the slightest. Foxy looks less like he's trying to murder me and more like I caught him dancing in the hallway.
Drop it.
And even though I enjoy playing the game as a strategy game with horror inspirations, there really isn't any denying that this is a horror game. And to be more specific, it's supposed to be a survival and psychological horror game. Really think about that. I'll be honest here. This game is not scary in the slightest. Some people might be scared of it for the first few nights, but by around night 2 or 3, once you've already probably seen all of the jump scares, the game isn't scary anymore, and it kinda gets frustrating and boring after all that. Though I would say that it does have a good length for what it's trying to do, and $5 really isn't a lot. I'd only recommend this game if you haven't seen a lot of it and you play the demo first. So if you did find enjoyment in the demo, you're gonna love this game. Trust me. But even if I don't think that's the best horror game ever, after a lot of YouTube channels played it, and even some really stupid ones, it blew up in popularity, and a sequel is then announced to be released in the following year of 2015. So the game was then released on November 10th, 2014, which is not even 3 months after the original game's release. And yes, there are a lot of things about the game that show it's rushed, but the entire experience as a whole is actually not bad. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 does a lot of good things that a sequel should do, be an extension of the first game without repeating the past adventure, and right from the get-go it sets itself apart from the original game with its presentation. While the first and second game do both have a saturated color palette, the first game has more purples and reds, while the second game has more yellows and pinks. And also the animatronics from the other game have gotten a new redesign. You have the new toy animatronic, and the old and more withered original animatronics. Something that I like about these new designs is that they don't go overboard with how cute and scary they look. Except for Toy Bonnie though, he doesn't want my soul, he wants my cuddles. We'll be selling sunshine. The game follows the original formula, but changes it up enough to make it feel new again. The name of the game is still ensuring that you don't get murdered by animatronics. But this time, instead of closing doors to keep them out, you're trying to get them into your office by putting on a Freddy mask and trying to fool them into thinking that you're one of the animatronics. This is actually a very creative and well thought out system, except for one thing. You see, the way that you use the mask is by flicking your mouse over a specific point on the screen, and the point right next to it is how you open your camera. Because at least when I was playing the game, there were a lot of points where I tried putting on the mask, but I accidentally opened the camera. On the horror side of things though, the game still does rely way too much on jump scares. It does still have the background music and even more audio cues, but it is still a jump scare fest. But to make the jump scares a bit more surprising, there are a few more animatronics this time. And by a few, I mean a lot. Like, way too many. It makes the entire gameplay experience cluttered and forces the player to keep track of way too many things at one time. There are almost 11 animatronics, all of which can kill you. You have to keep track of every single one of them, which basically means that anybody who's done the Golden Freddy challenge is utterly insane.
Oh my god! Oh, Scott, you're a jerk.
But hey, the games really aren't about the gameplay, it's more about the story, right? So how does this game build upon the lore of the first game? Okay, well first of all, the way that these games tell their stories is way too cryptic. Unlike in the first game where I actually enjoyed the vagueness of it, in this game, it makes that vagueness way too extreme, and I spent hours looking at theories and explanations just to find out what the heck was going on. So to save all of you trouble, welcome to the storyline of Five Nights at Freddy's 2. There was originally Fredbear Diner. One day there was a lonely child that sat by the door because I guess he didn't know how to use a door. As he was crying, he didn't know some man in purple walked up to him and murder happens. The man walks away undetected even though the diner was completely packed and he was murdered by a window. Also, in case you're wondering, the game's not going to elaborate on why the purple guy murdered the child. I guess he was just driving one day and thought, man, I wonder what it'd be like to murder somebody today. Maybe he plays too much video games. But after he does this, the diner closes and another pizzeria is opened. And for this pizzeria, the 4 animatronics are then created and then the diner then closes for reasons. After that, a new pizzeria is made and the purple guy gets a job at this new pizzeria so he can kill more children more easily. Why does he want to kill children? Because don't think about it, plot. So he does this by luring 5 children from a birthday party into a back room. So the spirit of the first murdered child then possesses a puppet that was at the pizzeria because he didn't know how to use a door, but I guess he knows how to possess things, and then puts the bodies of the newly dead children into the animatronics. Which is why the police never found them. Yep, somebody wrote this. I can't. So the spirits of the children realize they have nothing better to do and swear revenge against the purple guy, who switches jobs from the night shift to the day shift, leaving you in the night shift and leading the animatronics to think you're the purple guy and try to kill you, so happy birthday. Speaking of which, not long after Five Nights at Freddy's 2, one of the animatronics mistakes you for the purple guy and tries to kill you by biting, but only bites off your frontal lobe, so I guess you were lucky? After that, the place is then shut down. I hope you're paying attention, this is gonna be on the test later. And then they make another pizzeria because only happy fun adventures happen the other 3 times. So after that, they make a 4th restaurant, which is when the first game takes place because the second game takes place before the first game. God, and how is this brilliant narrative told to you in game? Remember when I said that I liked the simplicity of the first game's story? And look, I'm not saying that Five Nights at Freddy's shouldn't have a complex story, but dear God, I'm one of the only people I know that can follow the Kingdom Hearts story just fine, and even I had to do hours of research for this one. But also don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is a bad game. Even though I don't think it's as good as the first game, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a bad game. It has a lot of creative ideas, like making the game more scary, the puppet system, the mask system, and even having challenges in the custom night mode. I just feel like the game wasn't completely finished and needed a bit more work before it was released, especially in the story department. But even if I don't think that is the best story ever, people still wanted answers. So on January 26, 2015, Five Nights at Freddy's 3 was finally announced and then released March 2nd of the same year. So what do I think of Five Nights at Freddy's 3? I really like this one. So as you can see, the presentation and color scheme of these games are really nailed. Unlike the first two games that had varying bright saturated colors, this game has more rusted yellows and greens. And it's thankfully the final game of the franchise. The story takes place after the first game, when the purple guy sneaks into the restaurant. Seeing this, the spirit of the puppet, who left the puppet because... warns the others of his presence. One by one, they all get wrecked until they use the real superpower of teamwork to scare the purple guy into one of the old suits. But there's one major thing that the purple guy forgot about these old suits. Yep. In his dying breath, he sees the children for one last time. Finally satisfied and able to move on to the next life, because I guess they want to murder themselves. These are awful children. Until years later, until the old Bonnie suit that the purple guy was in is found, and then brought to a new horror attraction known as Freddy's Fright, which is based off of the purple man's murders, which is probably the most inconsiderate thing ever. And to your left, you can see the recreation of that child's murder. So in this game, you fight off Springtrap, who is the old Bonnie animatronic that is now possessed by the purple guy. And this is honestly my favorite story in the franchise. While yes, it is still told through death minigames, but these death minigames aren't random this time. And it doesn't just leave you questions to theorize about. It doesn't try to confuse the player to give them a false sense of involvement in the story, instead just giving them an actual sense of involvement. Your actions affect how the story closes, giving the children the happy ending they needed, or letting the purple man inside Springtrap win and murder again. This is why Five Nights at Freddy's 3 is my favorite game in the series. It doesn't focus on things like scares, because while it still tries to improve the scariness, it's not the game's priority. The actual gameplay is the game's priority. There's only one animatronic this time, meaning that you're not very scared of dying, which is an artsier sentence than I meant that to be. Though seriously, Springtrap looks less like he's seeking revenge and more like he's trying to ask me out.
Take me on a trip, I'd like to go someday.
But just because Springtrap isn't scary doesn't mean that the rest of the game isn't scary, because sometimes you'll be visited by phantom animatronics. These phantom animatronics don't kill you, but they do shut down a few of your systems, incentivizing you to not be frightened by them and instead work through your fears, which in this case is scarier. This is just one of the many ways that Five Nights at Freddy's 3 tries to change up the Five Nights at Freddy's formula. Like I said, there's only one animatronic in this game, and because of this, the game feels a lot more personal and less random and cheap. While the other games had you taking care of multiple animatronics, it felt like you were going through the same motions over and over again, making the game less scary and less interesting. Though with Springtrap, it's kind of like playing Alien Isolation while staying in one place. It's only one enemy trying to get you, one powerful and seemingly unpredictable enemy. He doesn't have any patterns he goes through, so you don't check the same light and close the same door to deal with him. He'll make sure that he gets in your office any way he can, by either hiding from the cameras or even crawling through the vents, to ensure that this time, he's not stopped. Now, after bashing Five Nights at Freddy's 2, it may seem like I'm crazy in love with this game, but trust me, there are a few nitpicky things that bother me about it. There are small things like having to click the prompts instead of just moving your mouse over them, and the excessive amount of visual noise making the camera hard to see. I think one major thing about this game that actually really bothers me is the execution of the multiple endings, which is the absolute worst thing ever. Though putting the good ending aside, I still do think that this is a pretty good game. More than the others, this game has more of an interesting story and engaging gameplay. It doesn't try to scare the player out of their mind with things that aren't scary, and doesn't try to engage the player in a story by confusing them. The main thing that this game wants to do is change the Five Nights at Freddy's formula to keep things interesting, while also giving the series the satisfying conclusion that the fans needed. I still hesitate to call this game a psychological horror, or even a horror, though I would say that it is one of the only games that genuinely startle me when I play it, and it's also one of the only games that I genuinely love playing, and at least it was able to end the series on a high note. That is, if Five Nights at Freddy's 4 wasn't the dumbest thing ever. Five Nights at Freddy's 4, the final chapter, was finally shown on July 13th of 2015 and then released 10 days later on the 23rd. Now, I'd like to look at something from all angles to try to give it a fair judgment, but even I have to ask, why does this exist again? I mean, the story was already complete, the book is already closed. You're just gonna fit the final chapter on that last blank page? I don't think there's enough room. Well, whatever. You play as a kid in a bedroom with 2 doors, cause that's a thing, I guess. And you fight more grotesque and nightmarish versions of the animatronics you've already faced. And this is because the game is a nightmare of a child, or should I say a teenager, as you only play as a small child in the death minigames. And in these minigames, you interact with your big brother, who terrorizes you with Freddy-related merchandise. It all leads up to the day of the little brother's birthday, but the brother and his friends take the teasing a little bit too far. On night 6, he tries to apologize to his little brother for what he and his friends have done, right before... And in the gameplay, you play as the bigger brother, defending himself in his room from the monsters in his head, the monsters that killed his little brother, the monsters he and his friends became that night. His guilt manifested into physical form. Wait, what does that remind me of again? Oh yeah! Silent Hill! The story of this game is very interesting and incredibly well done. Finally, a Five Nights at Freddy's game that has characters that I can actually attach myself to, characters that actually have development. Like I said, it's very intriguing and very well done. My main problem though is that this is the final chapter. If you replace the animatronics with anything else, the story would be virtually the exact same. So it is a good story on its own, but as a final chapter, the story leaves a lot to be desired. But what about the gameplay? After all, that was one of the main things I loved about Five Nights at Freddy's 3. Well, like I said, you play as a kid trying to keep the 4 animatronics out of his room. Bonnie and Chica come from the side halls, Foxy comes from your closet, and Freddy comes from your bed. The main problem with the system is that Bonnie and Chica are absolutely broken. So the way they're supposed to keep Bonnie and Chica out of your room is by listening to breathing, which unlike the other game where the sound effects and general sound design were a supplement to the gameplay, this game is absolutely dependent on its sound design. The main problem is its sound design isn't even good, so you'll be left here listening to breathing, which by the way, you don't even definitively know what the breathing sounds like, and in order to hear what you think is breathing, you have to turn your volume all the way up, which is the absolute last thing you want your player to do when you still use jump scares. So it's either you have your volume turned all the way down, or you turn it all the way up and pray to God that what you think is the breathing is actually the breathing. Because if you have your volume up and get jump scared, I don't think you're gonna be hearing anything really. Now I should mention that I've only played the initial version of this game, and that there have been 2 patches released trying to relieve both glitches and the problems with hearing the breathing. But even then, just allowing the player to listen to what the breathing sounds like before playing the game, or even be able to turn the background music down, would have helped this game astronomically. Overall, the game is very hit and miss. And honestly, that kind of describes most of the series for me. Overall hit and miss on how it wants to execute things. It wants to tell this incredibly engaging story, but without actually having the story, let alone telling it. And trust me, I was not kidding in the slightest when I said I spent hours researching for this video. The presentation though is spot on throughout all of the games. It genuinely looks like a Chuck E. Cheese with its modeling and animatronics looking really good. And surprisingly, none of them dipped in quality as the series went on. Unlike the sound design though, which works really well as a supplement to the main gameplay, giving you a clue as to what's happening outside of your field of vision. But the 4th game puts too much of a dependence on the sound design without actually improving it. And the gameplay, like I said earlier, play the demo of the game first before you actually buy the game, as your feelings about the gameplay is going to be incredibly subjective. I believe the game works better as a strategy game with horror inspirations, but calling any of these games horror games, quite frankly, goes against the very definition of horror. These games may be scary for the first few nights, but after a while, they'll cease to be horrifying at all. And once you're not scared of one of them, you won't be scared by any of them. So overall, the series as a whole gets a 7 out of 10. The series as a whole is kind of average. Not the best thing ever, but certainly not close to being the worst. If you're interested in the game and enjoyed playing the demo, I would highly suggest these games. But otherwise, I wouldn't say that you're missing a lot by skipping them. So thank you guys so much for watching. See you next adventure.